the first slide there, and this idea of language learning and technology. I thought it's interesting that we talk about language learning, and in the past week, I think that there's one language that has just been universal, and it's been that visual language in the case of cartoons. And the fact that cartoons are incredibly powerful because in an instant we understand a really complex story, potentially. And there's something very powerful about that is captured the essence of what is a complicated topic for so many people. And I began to think how really the image and that instantness of images is really the most common language we have today. And much of it is amplified by technology. When you think of the instantaneous nature that we can understand a cartoon, and then my mind jumped to Instagram, the fact that instantly you can understand what's going on. I thought of video games and the instant appeal of those to young people. And I compared that with my past in technology. If I go back 10 years to when I was using blogs and podcasts in the classroom, they were seen at the time as highly innovative. My school was indeed one of the first in Europe to blog, one of the first in Europe to, not just to blog, but one of the first in Europe to podcast as well, in collaboration with a school in Poland. It had all the ingredients that we expect of language learning: collaboration, a little dose of technology, and of course lots of language. Fast forward to 2015, and really the most fast-growing technologies amongst our young people and the language they choose to communicate and research with are visual. Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, which is not just a visual device for sharing one's message, but it's also the world's second biggest search engine. People are searching more for image and video than they are for text. And it resonates with something in learning in general that we know is incredibly powerful. And it's David Perkins in his book, Making Learning Whole, in this thesis, if you like, talks about the incredible power of that moment when you're learning. You understand everything there is. You understand the whole picture, even though you might not understand the elements you're trying to learn at that moment in time. And no school subject, no area is more affected by the difficulty in making learning whole than languages. What is the whole game of learning a language? Because if the game is fluency, then we have a huge disadvantage for a beginner learner in that fluency seems a long way off. And equally, as teachers, we can fall into the trap of merely presenting slices of knowledge and understanding with or without technology. So if we want to teach the past tense, we might talk this month about what we did in our winter holidays. So for that, we need to learn some vocabulary about the winter. If I was teaching French, I would need to teach them the past participles that are required. I would need to teach them the verb avoir. I would need to teach them all these components that make up the language. And before we know it, we've got to a point in time where the child, the learner, is left thinking, well, hold on, I thought I was here to learn French, or I thought I was here to learn English or German, but I've just learned all these elements. And I don't see the whole game because I'm still not fluent. I'm still not able to have a conversation on what I want to talk about. I'm still not able to write that piece that I want to write. Whereas the physical act of taking a photo, making a movie, drawing a cartoon represents what you might call a whole piece of learning, a whole game of learning. And for me, this resonates incredibly strongly because when you talk about the whole game of learning, in language learning, it's less to do with the mechanics of learning all those bits of the language, and it's more to do with those moments that as language learners we love. Now, I asked today Rachel, who looks after not only all my administration in my business, but I'm lucky that she also looks after my children when I'm busy doing talks like this and make sure they don't make noise when Daddy is talking to a bunch of Maltese people on the end of the line. And I asked her, I said, you know, when you were learning French at school, what do you remember from it? And it's interesting because she was actually one of my students at school, and she now works for me. And I don't know if that's a success story in my French teaching or not. But when we talked about what those memories were, those things that she would remember, the first thing that was interesting, she took a long time to remember what those moments were. And I took a long time too. And I would ask you, if you were thinking about those moments that you will always remember about teaching and learning, what would they be? And for me, it's experiences inevitably when I've gone overseas, when I've lived the language. A huge investment financially, a huge investment in terms of time, and not very repeatable, not very accessible. Other experiences were based in, so the real world for sure, but they were based in the real fake world that my teacher created, that environment. And when I was at school, we did not have the technology that we have today to create that environment. And so what we've got is a shift, if you like, in what we're able to do to create those memorable moments. And that's kind of what I wanted to look at today. For me, language learning and technology is about how we create those memorable moments that students always remember. There was actually a wonderful notion. I'm just going to share my screen again. I want to show you an excerpt from a book. You can actually find this book yourself online. It's written by an author called Nancy Duarte. The book title is Resonate. Let me just show you the front cover very briefly. And Resonate is actually all about creating stories through slides, creating visual stories that compel people to do things. Well, I've used it with 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds learning language. And I've used it because it's a book that's all about telling stories. And when you look at this notion of star moments, a star moment is something they'll always remember. So when Steve Jobs used to unveil his Apple products, he would always say, you know, here's the MacBook Air, it's so thin, it even fits inside of one of those envelopes you see floating around the office. You've also got, if I just, I've got lost in my own book. Hold on, let me go back. I'm going to go back to this page here. It was 174. So this definition of a star moment is something they'll always remember. And so when we are thinking about planning a lesson, a project, a unit of work, an experience for our young people, are we able to plan something they'll always remember into each of those moments? It might feel like doing a star moment in every lesson is overkill, but actually I'm not so sure. That's the whole point of a lesson, surely, is to have a memorable learning point that when the kid leaves the room at the end of that lesson, when they leave the room at the end of the day, they're able to answer one simple question, which is, where have you been in your learning today? And where do you think you are now? And they might even be able to answer the question, where are you going next with your learning? And Nancy Duarte defines this star moment as something significant, sincere, or enlightening that helps magnify the big idea that we're trying to get across. So again, in a lesson, instead of thinking about language learning as all these little elements that we have to chop up, that seems to be the way that textbook manufacturers think we learn language. Can we think of a way of chunking learning that allows us to actually take a big idea and make the big idea what language learning is about? And technology is a great vehicle for doing that. One of the things we can do is look at how we set up that kind of lesson structure or project structure. When I was at Channel 4 television, I worked there trying to come up with creative ideas to engage audiences, teenage audiences quite often. And the title, the slogan motto at Channel 4 was this: do it first, make trouble, inspire change. And as a mantra, it was really useful. When you saw an idea and you thought, am I going to show this idea to this 14-year-old, 15-year-old age group? You would ask yourself, have they ever seen this before? Because if they have, they're going to be bored by it unless you do something different with it. Is the idea cantankerous? Is it provocative? And provocation is a huge friend for language learning, for learning in general. And provocation is obviously what cartoons and strong visuals are all about. They combine two ideas that shouldn't go with each other, and they make you think. And then inspire change, the idea that we can activate people to go off and actually do things. One thing that we can do is that, real world is not necessarily always about making things really real. This is a teacher friend of mine, just on Facebook, I think it was 2 days ago, and she's down in New Zealand. She's a principal of a primary school, and she's asking her friends, I'm planning an exciting year ahead, and I'm wanting to put some of the cool days that come up in our calendar. So far I have Talk Like a Pirate Day, Dot Day, Dr. Seuss Day, Roald Dahl's birthday, the 100th day of school, New Zealand Road Safety Week. What else is there I can continue? And she's reached out to her learning community to try and find the predictable moments of real world that she can connect learning, in the broadest sense, to. So that when students are in the school year, there is a rhythm that's not dictated by that kind of firefighting, knee-jerk thing that all teachers do. We think, oh gosh, next week is the National Week of Language Learning. What are we going to do? And it's this huge big rush to get something ready. And it always feels a little bit short. But instead, we can plan a year in advance around some of these key topical celebrations and tie language learning to that. It could be Harry Potter's birthday. It could be a celebration of something to do with the foreign language you're learning, or it could simply be one of those big language learning festivals that happen throughout the whole year. So that's one example where real world doesn't necessarily, it can be plannable. It doesn't have to be a reaction to whatever was in today's newspaper to make something feel real, authentic, and give it that star moment quality. When I was teaching in 2005, making that connection to the real world was actually a very long investment. If you think about it, we were blogging and podcasting, which was incredibly rich at that time, but at the same time, really time consuming, because we would have to reach out to a school through the likes of e-twinning or through personal contacts, and we would have to set up a kind of school exchange. It took forever, and it meant that relationships took time to get together. If the relationship actually ended up being a bit wrong and not quite right for our students, it was very difficult to back out of it, because we've now invested in a kind of professional friendship. Or worse, we've got a school partnership, an official school partnership, displayed on the e-twinning website, for example. And now it's like a marriage, and we don't have the prenup that allows us to separate our schools. So we end up with this challenge 10 years ago that all real world, authentic language learning connections through technology were actually lifelong commitments. That's what they felt like. Well, 10 years on, our commitments can be quite short. We don't actually have to do these big, long marriage for life type projects. We can reach out very quickly through a myriad of technologies and do what I call connections in brief, much in the same way as some of us may reach out to each other on Twitter or by email or on Facebook, very briefly to clarify a question from this evening. Well, in the same way, our students don't have to have long-term online connections with another school in order to get something out of that relationship. I'm going to share something with you, which is a brainstorming tool that we've used for planning. When we plan projects with teachers, we split up planning into two parts. One is, what activities can the students do for themselves? And in those activities, we do have a spot up here for direct teaching. So we often ask teachers, when you're planning a project, can you plan the actual teaching you're going to do last? And if the thing that you want them to learn can be learned by them in any other way, can you give them the activity, the website for the museum or the gallery? Can you give them the school trip, the excursion? Can you give them an activity that allows them to role play, for example? Is there anything else that they can do to learn? And likewise, there are resources. And all too often, resources in language learning and teaching are web resources. They can maybe be a foreign language assistant if you're lucky. But what about reaching out on an ad hoc basis to a foreign language speaker or a classroom on the other side of the world to find out how they feel about something going on today in the news? If you're learning French, it would be really interesting to reach out to a school in Paris to find out what the last week has felt like, to try and gain empathy. But it's very hard to do that if you think the relationship has to be made from concrete. If there is a mechanism, and there is a mechanism, it's called your personal learning network. It's getting on Twitter and being part of those MFL, modern foreign language Twitterati tags, or being part of the Malta BLT and using each other's black books of contacts to find out, who's got a connection that I can borrow for my class this week, because we need to reach out quickly and have a conversation with someone. But it doesn't have to be synchronous. There's so much available that's asynchronous. I've been just on YouTube diving into full-length films on YouTube. Now, they may not be there legally, but they are there. So you're able to look at long films that go into the biographies of people that I'm interested in. And it's content that's just not available on British television. I have to go to French TV to see that. And of course, you've got existing resources. There's also the case for planning time for students just to have some silent time and to go off into what they're interested in. But you've also got this amazing resource of TED Talks. Particularly amazing if the foreign language is English, because most TED Talks are in English. And if you're not familiar with TED Talks, it's worth going to TED.com just to explore. I wanted to share with you a quick project that's all about those TED Talks. And I'll finish with this story and then open up the floor to some questions. This story is based in a place called Sunderland in England. Here's maps for those who want to picture it. This is the primary school that we were working in. Looks like any other primary school, frankly. It's based in a place called Thorney Close in Sunderland. It's in the northeast of England, next to the sea, but in a relatively poor area. Coal mining, quite a lot of unemployment, and it's based up just south of Newcastle. And if I zoom right out, you'll get a sense of where it is in relation to the rest of the UK. Now, what's interesting about this particular place is that the challenge those teachers had was all around speaking and listening. And then the more we talked to each other in planning a project together, I realized that these students didn't just struggle with speaking and listening, but they also wanted to write more. They wanted students to have more ambition in writing. And so they needed help in doing just that. So what did we do? Well, it was interesting because I didn't know what to do. I really didn't know what to do. And the first thing let me share a different screen there. The first thing I thought was we're going to have to do something quite radical here. And I didn't have time to plan something radical. So if you can imagine, I turn up at this primary school and I'm thinking, okay, so we need to give concentration, speaking and listening. But it's going to be very hard to do if we have just a lack of confidence in language learning, full stop. And so the first thing I did, partly to win a bit of time and partly to get to know the students, was show a video. And this was the first video I showed. So this is Bobby McFerrin, the famous jazz musician, and as you can see from the title of the talk, it's not really designed for the age of students I was dealing with. These students were about 7 and 8 years old. But when they saw this video, the first thing they said is, "We love it. What is it?" And we asked, "Well, what do you think neurons are?" And they thought it's something to do with the brain. Okay, so what do you think neuroscience might be? And we started going into language that they hadn't learned before, new language, and they were guessing, hypothesizing about what they were seeing. There was a great deal of uncertainty. Now, the wonderful thing about that clip was that we then said, okay, well, let's go and look at some more videos. And I just wanted to show you the kind of video that we were looking at. This is one example. This is when we were talking to them about the fact that people do give talks. It's a thing people do. The first thing they said is, well, hold on, we are 7, we are 8. There's a limit to how interesting our talks could be. They expressed it in a different way, but that was more or less what they were saying. And I found this talk very quickly on the TED website called The Intelligence of Crows. And the point I wanted to make is even the most banal thing can be really interesting. You can make it interesting through language, through the language you choose. Just take a look at this and you'll see how actually the language is not that complex, but the story is something you will always remember.
And I'll give you an example of that. So this is Betty. She's a New Caledonian crow, and these crows use sticks in the wild to get insects and whatnot out of pieces of wood. Here she's trying to get a piece of meat out of a tube, but the researchers had a problem. They messed up and left just a stick of wire in there. And she hadn't had the opportunity to do this before. You see it wasn't working very well. So she adapted. Now this is completely unprompted. She had never seen this done before. No one taught her to bend this into a hook. No one had shown her how it could happen, but she did it all on her own. So keep in mind that she's never seen this done. Right. Yeah. All right.
So again, the huge power of this is that the language is simple. The language is almost unimportant, but the content engages. And the first thing that we've been looking at with the use of the image in technology that is so pervasive is the fact that it engages young people immediately. And it does a second job. It inspires young people. I've shown that video to adults and I've shown it to very young children, and they're equally astounded and inspired by what they see. So the next thing they want to do is explore. They want to dive into greater detail. And they can do that by Googling this guy. They can maybe go and have a look about his research. They can maybe dive into that. It's very authentic, and it's very difficult. But because they've been engaged, because they've been inspired, the motivation is there. A bit like an afterburner fuel on a fast aircraft. It won't last forever, but it's enough to push them into the research. It's enough to push them into an independent language learning. And that clip was particularly of interest to them. Can you just tell me if, oh no, I think if I put it full screen, you can't see it anymore. So I'll show you another quick clip. This is another TED Talk. It's from an American scientist, marine scientist, called David Gallo. And this talk was all about underwater worlds.
We're going to go on a dive to the deep sea, and anyone that's had that lovely opportunity knows that for about 2.5 hours on the way down, it's a perfectly positively pitch black world.
So when we started watching this, we actually turned the volume to 0. And the first thing I asked the students was, what is it you're seeing? And this was purely adjectives and adverbs. I wanted them to describe what they were seeing in the simplest possible way. So they were seeing glowing spines in the dark, or they were seeing, this one was a floating chicken, or a luminous chicken. They saw other things that they thought looked like fireworks. Now they realized, it's not a Catherine's wheel, it's not fireworks. They knew they were seeing something underwater, but it was able to give them imaginative language that they wouldn't normally use. And it allows them to get their imaginations going. What do you think you're seeing here? Where do you think we might be? Very simple questions, very lower order questions. And much of that kind of lower order stuff, I use these thinking cubes for. So a thinking cube is a dice. There are 6 of them here in a pack. And we have a free download as well, which allows you to make paper ones. So when you throw the remembering dice, the yellow one, what happened after that? Where is this? Can you list 3 adjectives to describe what it is you're seeing. And you can throw these around the class. They're soft enough not to do any damage. As the students see more and more wondrous things, you might want to ask slightly more difficult questions. But the best thing about these is you can translate these into any foreign language and throw them around the class to the students and get students to develop their own questions. One of the hardest things to do is get students to learn how to authentically ask their own questions. This works particularly well when it's coupled with the kind of rich content that you're seeing through these videos, through the visual once more. The second thing we did was get a student. This particular student was very quiet and he volunteered to be the narrator. So he came up and using the language that's printed on the screen was able to give a little bit of a rundown of what it was he was seeing. And he was able to give a running commentary of what he was seeing. So he stood up in front of his class, no preparation, and did his best. The language is once more simple, but he's got some support and he's got questions being asked by me, by his teacher, by some of his peers to do that. I'm just going to show you this final thing. The quality of these, I have to say, beats any textbook that we could ever muster up. I think that that's a really important point. The quality of these wonderful undersea creatures. You might think, well, hold on, where do undersea creatures feature in the Maltese language curriculum or in any foreign language curriculum for that matter? But what we're using this for is stimulus to get students communicating, to get them thinking about the language that they use, about adjectives. And our learning goals here were to give students a richer basic vocabulary and to get them thinking about how they structure a compelling sentence. Not just learning how to say some phrases about going to the park and what you did on holidays and eating in a cafe, which is, you might argue, is useful functional language, but it's not going to entice learners, it's not going to engage them, it's certainly not going to inspire them. Can we provide a much more inspiring, standing ovation-worthy type experience for young people by digging into the things that are available? If you're wanting that question sheet to work off, we have a web page on our website called The Lab, and in this you can get the design thinking immersion planner that I used earlier on, and you can also get higher order question sheets that you can adapt for any foreign language that you're teaching. So where did this project go next? Well, the students had expressed a great interest in terms of having a go at using the TED Talks that they had been looking at as inspiration for, that challenge of doing 2 things at once. I think I'm a typical guy. I can't manage it. The students were really keen to use the TED Talks that they had seen and do some of their own. So the first thing we looked at was, how do you tell a story? If you wanted to give one of these talks yourself, you need to know how to tell a good story. So the first thing we did was this. We literally told some stories. Let me just see if I can get that video to play. There we go. So this is me reading a big book of Little Red Riding Hood, one of the world's best fairy tales, of course. Students of all ages really enjoy reading these. I've used them with high school students, not for the story, because they all know the story. I used the big book because the structure within the story is a structure that anyone can borrow to tell a very compelling story with very simple language. And we asked the students to identify all these points as we read the story. And we wrote them up into a kind of Bible of tactics and strategies for creating a strong story with very simple language. Second thing we did was we looked at video games. And video games are that context that young people really understand and really get engaged by. This is the opening screen to a game called Machinarium. So you can imagine the day we've worked with students so far on structure, we've worked with students and the ingredients of a strong story. In that case, it was Little Red Riding Hood. They went off, incidentally, and probably watched nearly 200 TED Talks between them. So they split the task. They were immersed in that video content, trying to understand with prompting questions and cue cards everything they could about those stories. And now there was a need to enrich their vocabulary. We needed something to enrich their vocabulary. So the use of the video game was a really interesting context to do that. And what I want to do is I'm going to take you over to my iPad, and let me just get this all geared up. Here we go. So taking you over to my iPad to show you this game, Machinarium. And you'll hopefully hear the sounds in it as well, the sound effects. Oh, nothing like some advertising when you don't want it. Okay, so when I touch this game and get it started, the first thing that you notice is that all games have this kind of holding screen. And the holding screen it's got a little bit of sound to it. Don't know if you can hear that. It's got an atmosphere. It's got a mood. And what we asked students to do was to think about how this inspired them. That's too broad. So we gave them some design constraints for this task. And the design constraints were to write the best short story you've ever written, but you've only got 20 minutes to do it, and you can only use 2 sentences. And so I'm going to read to you some of what these students came up with, because I think you'll agree that their writing belies the fact that they are students who have struggled, perhaps, with writing in the past. Here we go. In an ancient, horrifying castle on a mysterious hill, in a bubbly, pitch-black sky, I chopped down like a prickly skeleton bone. I can hear a dino roar. The gruesome, grisly castle laid on a horrifying planet. The trees looked like ghouls' hands emerging out of the volcanic ground. There was a spooky, flying robot. The deadly castle, as if in a graveyard, the trees charging out in rage. And all of that is before you even press play a game. And I think you would agree that that quality of writing is very high quality, but it's structurally very simple. So even a novice language learner, with the help of a dictionary and the imagination they have, which is not a novice's imagination, it's a teenager's imagination or a young learner's imagination or an adult's imagination, they can create some amazing language that they are proud of using very simple techniques indeed. That you would use normally in a classroom in any case. So let me carry on this story and explain where we went next. And I'll share some of the images from where we went. Let me just share the screen once more, and we'll go back to the presentation. So the first thing was they started to structure their story. So much like I've structured this talk, we use Post-it notes and cards so that the structure of their language wasn't indelibly written on a Word document. It's funny how Word or even Google Docs, they are designed so that you can write something and delete it and reorder it easily. But that's not how students use them when they're writing in a foreign language. Students use them much like they would write a piece of language on a piece of paper. So if you are using these tools, before you touch a computer, much like any great author or great planner, write your ideas down first in Post-it note form, because it allows you very quickly to move them around, rip them up. You haven't invested too much time in them. When you've written them up on the computer, especially as a student, you'll know how students want to change the font. They want to make it look beautiful immediately. And actually not using the technology too early on is the most powerful thing we can do for our students there. Second, once they've built that plan, they can create slightly longer scripts, if you like, in order to form the ideas, in order to really understand what it is they're trying to understand. all these techniques are from the Resonate book. They're all stories that have emerged from that book. And something else we did was concentrate on how students felt during their learning. So my colleague Tom asked them questions throughout the learning journey, and you'll see that it's full of troughs and peaks. The troughs are not when students necessarily find it the most difficult. It's when they found the thinking difficult, but the language is something that they found they didn't think about. They were able just to do it. Before they gave their talk, they were scared, they were frightened, they were excited, they were shy, they were nervous, terrified. And these emotions are really strong, but it showed that they cared about their language that they were learning. After the talks, they were relieved, amazed, they were proud, they were happy. And this is what it looked like on the day when they actually came to do their TED. They had constructed their own stage. They had formally registered the TED as a TEDx. So it was officially on the website. The students were really surprised at how well their peers did in this. And this is the kind of talk title that they came up with. Here is the venue. They managed to find the university, a space in the university where they could present. So once more, Real World is not just about publishing a video on YouTube. It's about making sure that the live experience of that language performance is in the real world too. They presented to an audience of their peers, but also to an audience of nearly 300 strangers. And they then presented talks that they had prepared. And it was interesting. They said, this is a child speaking after the event. They said, since we did that TED talk, we haven't done a school assembly. But when we do, I feel like I'll be dead confident because I did this in front of 250 people. We shared out through Twitter. We shared this out to the world. And so their talks were heard about and commented upon from people in Australia, Canada, France, around Africa, even into India. And the talk titles were not the typical kind of talk that a child would give in a foreign language classroom. The titles were things like, do animals talk? Do babies have a secret language? Which cancer should we invest in curing first? Why do slugs need slime? And why do people still need to get sick? And this girl's something they'll always remember moment was actually constructing vomit live on stage and throwing it out into the audience. And we were able to engage every student in this, even those students who would perhaps be deemed as finding this a very difficult exercise for one reason or another, participated. They were absolutely engaged by each other's efforts too. The teacher said, I learnt to trust the children and to let them go in a direction that they want to do, that they're going to trust that they're going to make the right decisions. And through their independent efforts, they amazed themselves and they amazed each other. This is a student congratulating one of his peers on the talk that he's just given. And what was important for them was realizing that there were people all over the world engaging with what they were doing. And I think that's hugely powerful, hugely engaging learning of language. And the language they were using was incredibly simple. There was nothing overly complex about what we were doing, but it was the context that was authentic. It was the technology that opened up ambition and opened up the potential to do something more than simply picking up the next chapter of the textbook and hoping that the children will get to the end of the unit without being too bored, that they'll do their homework, that they'll not kick up too much of a fuss if it's not the most exciting thing that they've learnt that week. In my view, learning of this variety can be super exciting, and we can show students that we value their thinking as much as their language learning. It's the greatest barrier that language learning, foreign language learning has, is this idea that we are teaching baby steps in a language, despite the fact our students don't think like babies. I've got some links there to help, referring to things that I've talked to in the talk. The Notosh Lab should be useful for you, and you can reach out on Facebook as well to see stories of how teachers all over the world are thinking about that notion of authenticity and what it might mean for them.